The conflict between Israelis and Palestinians is one of the longest, most complicated, and deeply emotional struggles in modern history. To understand the wars that followed, we must first go back to the origins, to the late 19th century, when nationalism was rising across the world and two movements, Zionism and Arab nationalism, were beginning to take shape in the Middle East. In the late 1800s, European Jews faced waves of anti-Semitism, discrimination, and even violent pogroms. Many Jews dreamed of returning to their ancestral homeland, the land of ancient Israel, known historically as Palestine. This dream grew into a political movement called Zionism, founded officially by Theodor Herzl in 1897 at the First Zionist Congress in Basel, Switzerland. Herzl and other Zionist leaders argued that Jews could only be safe if they had their own state. Their goal was to establish a national home for Jews in Palestine, then part of the Ottoman Empire. At that time, Palestine's population was overwhelmingly Arab, Muslim, and Christian, with a small Jewish minority living mostly in Jerusalem and other holy cities. Under Ottoman rule, the Jewish presence in Palestine slowly increased. From the late 19th century through the early 20th century, Jewish immigrants, many from Eastern Europe, began arriving in waves known as aliyahs. They purchased land, often from absentee Arab landlords, and established new agricultural communities. But this immigration created tension. For the Arab inhabitants, the sudden increase in Jewish settlers felt like a threat to their land, culture, and political future. Small clashes and disputes over land began to emerge. The story dramatically changed during World War I. The Ottoman Empire sided with Germany, and when the Allies won, the Middle East was carved up. Britain captured Palestine in 1917, and soon after it issued the Balfour Declaration. This declaration stated that Britain supported the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people. For Jews worldwide, this was a monumental moment, international recognition of their aspirations. But for the Arab population, it felt like a betrayal. During the war, Britain had also promised independence to Arab leaders in return for their support against the Ottomans. These conflicting promises sowed the seeds of distrust. In 1920, the League of Nations officially gave Britain the mandate for Palestine, giving it control of the region. Jewish immigration increased, supported by Zionist organizations and fueled by growing persecution in Europe. Arab opposition also grew stronger, leading to violence and riots. During the 1920s, violent clashes broke out between Arabs and Jews in cities like Jerusalem and Hebron. Arab leaders argued that Jews were taking their land and changing the demographic balance. Jews, on the other hand, felt they had a historical and moral right to build their homeland. The 1930s made the situation even worse. As Adolf Hitler rose to power in Germany, Jews faced horrific persecution, prompting even more to flee to Palestine. The Arab Revolt of 1936 to 1939 erupted as Palestinian Arabs launched strikes, protests, and violent attacks against both Jews and the British. Britain responded with military force, suppressing the revolt but leaving bitterness behind. The outbreak of World War II brought tragedy and urgency. 6 million Jews were murdered in the Holocaust, one of the darkest chapters in human history. For survivors, the idea of a Jewish homeland was no longer just a dream, it was a matter of survival. Thousands of Holocaust survivors tried to reach Palestine, often in defiance of British immigration restrictions. The British, under pressure from Arab opposition, limited Jewish immigration. But this only fueled resentment. Zionist groups began to resist British control, some using violence against British soldiers and officials. By 1947, Britain was exhausted. The violence between Jews and Arabs had escalated, and the British decided to hand the problem over to the newly formed United Nations. The UN proposed a partition plan, which suggested dividing Palestine into two states, one Jewish and one Arab, with Jerusalem placed under international administration. Jews, though not completely satisfied, accepted the plan. It gave them recognition and sovereignty, something they desperately sought. The Arab side, however, rejected it outright. They argued it was unfair, since the Jewish population was still a minority yet was allocated significant territory. On November 29, 1947, the UN General Assembly voted in favor of the partition plan. Celebrations broke out in Jewish communities, while protests and violence spread in Arab towns. Clashes between Jewish militias and Arab fighters escalated into civil war within Palestine. By May 1948, the situation had reached a boiling point. The British prepared to withdraw, unable to maintain order. On May 14, 1948, Jewish leaders declared the independence of the State of Israel. For Jews, it was the fulfillment of a centuries-old dream. For Palestinians, it was the beginning of what they would later call the Nakba or catastrophe. Within hours of Israel's declaration of independence, neighboring Arab states, Egypt, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, and Iraq, launched an invasion. The first full-scale Arab-Israeli war had begun. On May 14, 1948, David Ben-Gurion, the head of the Jewish Agency, declared the independence of the State of Israel. For Jews, this was the realization of their national dream. For Palestinians, it marked the beginning of dispossession. And for the Arab states, it was seen as a provocation that could not be tolerated. The very next day, armies from Egypt, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, and Iraq invaded the new state, launching what became known as the First Arab-Israeli War, or the War of Independence for Israelis and the Nakba or catastrophe for Palestinians. At first glance, the Arab states appeared to have the upper hand. They had larger, better-equipped armies compared to the relatively small Jewish militias. But Israel had certain advantages: high morale, a unified leadership under the newly formed Israel Defense Forces, IDF, and strong organizational networks that had been built during the British Mandate period. Initially, the Arab armies made quick advances. In the south, Egypt moved into the Negev Desert. In the east, Jordan's Arab Legion, one of the most professional armies in the Arab world, captured East Jerusalem, including the Old City. Syrian and Iraqi forces pushed into northern Palestine. For the Jewish communities, the situation was desperate. Supply lines were cut off, Jerusalem was under siege, and the survival of the new state seemed uncertain. The United Nations quickly intervened, calling for a ceasefire in June 1948. During this pause, Israel used the time to regroup, reorganize, and acquire weapons from abroad, most notably from Czechoslovakia, which provided desperately needed arms shipments. When fighting resumed, Israel was in a much stronger position. The IDF launched counteroffensives, breaking Arab sieges and securing vital territory. Several major battles defined the war. Jerusalem. Fierce fighting erupted for control of the Holy City. Jewish forces managed to hold onto West Jerusalem, while Jordan's Arab Legion took East Jerusalem and the Old City. This division would remain until 1967. Lydda and Ramel. In July 1948, Israeli forces captured the towns of Lydda, Lod, and Ramel, leading to the expulsion of tens of thousands of Palestinian civilians. These events became symbolic of the wider displacement known as the Nakba. The Negev campaign. Towards the end of the war, Israeli forces launched operations in the Negev Desert, defeating Egyptian troops and solidifying control over the south. The Nakba, the Palestinian exodus, one of the most significant consequences of the war, was the mass displacement of Palestinians. Around 700,000 Palestinians fled or were expelled from their homes during the fighting. Some left to escape violence, others were forced out by Israeli military operations, and many hoped to return once the war ended. But the war ended with Israel in control, and the refugees were not allowed back. They settled in neighboring Arab countries, the West Bank, Gaza, and refugee camps across the Middle East. This refugee crisis remains one of the central issues of the conflict to this day. Armistice agreements of 1949. By early 1949, it was clear that the Arab states could not defeat Israel. One by one, they signed armistice agreements under UN supervision. Egypt signed in February 1949. Lebanon followed in March. Jordan in April. Finally, Syria in July. Iraq did not sign an armistice, but its troops withdrew. The agreements established new boundaries, known as the Green Line, which defined Israel's borders until 1967. Israel ended up controlling about 77% of the territory of Mandatory Palestine, more than what the UN partition plan had originally allocated. Jordan took control of the West Bank and East Jerusalem, while Egypt administered the Gaza Strip. For Israel, it was a triumph, survival against overwhelming odds, the creation of a functioning state, and international recognition. For Palestinians, it was a tragedy. The loss of their homeland, the destruction of hundreds of villages, and the creation of a refugee crisis that has lasted generations. For the Arab states, it was a humiliation. Despite their combined strength, they failed to destroy Israel, which led to political instability in many of their countries. The First Arab-Israeli War set the stage for decades of conflict. The Palestinian refugee question remained unresolved. Jerusalem was divided. The borders were only armistice lines, not permanent peace agreements. Both sides prepared for the next round of fighting, knowing the conflict was far from over. In the years immediately after 1949, small border skirmishes, raids, and retaliations continued, keeping the tension alive. The Arab world did not recognize Israel's legitimacy, and Palestinians, displaced and stateless, continued to demand justice. This uneasy truce would last less than a decade. By 1956, the region was once again on the brink of war, this time over the Suez Canal and the shifting dynamics of the Cold War. The armistice agreements of 1949 ended the First Arab-Israeli War, but they did not bring peace. For Palestinians, the trauma of the Nakba was fresh. For Arab states, Israel's existence remained unacceptable. And for Israel, survival was still fragile, surrounded by hostile neighbors, with no permanent borders, and carrying the burden of absorbing hundreds of thousands of Jewish immigrants from Europe and the Middle East. The 1950s became a decade of mounting tension. Border clashes, guerrilla raids, and political rivalries all pushed the region toward another war. That war came in 1956 in what became known as the Suez Crisis, or the Second Arab-Israeli War. In the early 1950s, Palestinian refugees in Gaza and the West Bank began launching cross-border raids into Israel. These fighters, known as fedayeen, carried out attacks on villages, farms, and infrastructure. For Palestinians, these raids were acts of resistance. For Israel, they were acts of terrorism. Israel responded with harsh reprisals. Its military launched cross-border raids into Jordan, Egypt, and Syria, targeting villages suspected of harboring fighters. These reprisals often caused civilian casualties, escalating the cycle of violence. By the mid-1950s, the southern border with Egypt, particularly the Gaza Strip, became the main flashpoint. Egypt, under its new leader Gamal Abdel Nasser, began supporting the fedayeen, providing them with weapons and bases. Nasser, who came to power in Egypt after the 1952 revolution, quickly became a symbol of Arab nationalism. He promised to liberate Palestine, unite the Arab world, and resist Western imperialism. For Israel, Nasser's rhetoric and actions were alarming. For Britain and France, Nasser's growing independence threatened their influence in the Middle East, especially over the Suez Canal, a vital trade route connecting Europe and Asia. The Suez Canal had long been controlled by Britain and France. In July 1956, Nasser shocked the world by nationalizing the canal, taking control away from the Europeans. He argued that Egypt had the right to use canal revenues to fund its own development, including the Aswan Dam project. Britain and France, furious over the loss of their strategic asset, began plotting a military response. Israel, feeling increasingly threatened by Egypt's growing military strength and fedayeen attacks, saw an opportunity to strike at its most dangerous neighbor with European support. In October 1956, Israel, Britain, and France secretly met in Sèvres, France, and hatched a plan. The strategy was simple. Israel would invade the Sinai Peninsula, advancing toward the Suez Canal. Then Britain and France would intervene, pretending to act as peacekeepers to separate the two sides. But in reality, they would use the opportunity to regain control of the canal. This secret pact set the stage for war. On October 29, 1956, Israel launched Operation Kadesh, a surprise attack on Egypt. Israeli paratroopers were dropped deep into the Sinai, while armored divisions advanced rapidly toward the canal. Within days, Israeli forces captured the Gaza Strip and much of the Sinai Peninsula, showcasing their military efficiency. As planned, Britain and France issued ultimatums to both Egypt and Israel, demanding they withdraw from the Canal Zone. When Nasser refused, British and French forces launched airstrikes against Egypt and began preparations for a ground invasion. But the plot backfired. The United States and the Soviet Union, despite being Cold War rivals, both opposed the invasion. President Dwight D. Eisenhower feared the crisis would destabilize the Middle East and push Arab nations toward the Soviet camp. The Soviet Union threatened direct intervention against the attackers. Under immense pressure, Britain and France were forced to back down. Their attempt to reassert imperial control had failed, marking the decline of their power in the region. For Israel, the Suez War was a mixed result. Militarily, it had proven itself capable of defeating Egypt and capturing the Sinai. But diplomatically, Israel was compelled to withdraw from the Sinai Peninsula under U.S. and UN pressure. In return, Israel received important guarantees. A United Nations Emergency Force, UNEF, was deployed in Sinai to act as a buffer. The Strait of Tiran, a vital shipping route to Israel's port of Eilat, was declared open to Israeli shipping. This gave Israel secure access to the Red Sea and trade routes to Asia and Africa. The Suez Crisis had major consequences beyond Israel and Egypt. Nasser emerged as a hero across the Arab world. Though Egypt lost militarily, his defiance against Britain, France, and Israel elevated him as the champion of Arab nationalism. Britain and France lost influence in the Middle East. Their failure exposed their declining power, leaving the United States and the Soviet Union as the dominant players in regional politics. The Cold War deepened in the Middle East, with both superpowers competing for allies. For Palestinians, the Suez Crisis did not bring liberation. Gaza remained under Egyptian administration, and the West Bank under Jordanian rule. The refugee crisis continued, with no progress toward a solution. Although the Suez War ended with Israeli withdrawal, it did not resolve the underlying issues. Fedayeen attacks continued. Arab states, led by Nasser, increased their calls for the destruction of Israel. Meanwhile, Israel grew more confident in its military capabilities but also more aware of its isolation. The uneasy calm that followed was only temporary. Within a decade, a much larger and more dramatic war would erupt. One that would reshape the map of the Middle East entirely. That war was the Six-Day War of 1967. By the mid-1960s, tensions in the Middle East were at a boiling point. The uneasy peace that followed the Suez Crisis of 1956 was fragile. Fedayeen raids continued across Israel's borders. Arab nationalism, led by Egypt's Gamal Abdel Nasser, was rising. The Arab states pledged to liberate Palestine. Israel, meanwhile, felt increasingly surrounded and threatened. This volatile situation exploded in June 1967, in what became known as the Six-Day War, a short but monumental conflict that would change the map of the Middle East and redefine the Israeli-Palestinian struggle. Throughout the early 1960s, border clashes intensified. Syria, from the Golan Heights, shelled Israeli villages below. Palestinian guerrilla groups, such as Fatah led by Yasser Arafat, launched raids into Israel from bases in Syria, Jordan, and Lebanon. Meanwhile, Arab leaders increased their military rhetoric. Nasser of Egypt emerged as the most powerful figure, promoting Arab unity under his leadership. By 1967, Egypt and Syria had formed a military alliance, with Jordan later joining. The Cold War also played a role. The Soviet Union supported Egypt and Syria with weapons and training, while the United States became a growing supporter of Israel. In May 1967, the situation spiraled out of control. Soviet intelligence falsely warned Egypt that Israel was preparing to attack Syria. In response, Nasser ordered the UN peacekeepers out of the Sinai Peninsula, peacekeepers who had been stationed there since 1956. Egypt then massed troops in Sinai and closed the Strait of Tiran to Israeli shipping. For Israel, this was a red line. Arab states escalated their rhetoric. Crowds in Cairo and Damascus cheered for war. Jordan signed a defense pact with Egypt. For Israel, the threat was existential. Surrounded by 3 hostile armies, its leaders feared annihilation. On the morning of June 5, 1967, Israel launched a preemptive strike. In a daring and meticulously planned operation, the Israeli Air Force destroyed the Egyptian Air Force on the ground within hours. By the end of the day, Israel had also struck Syria and Jordan, achieving total air superiority. With control of the skies, Israeli ground forces advanced rapidly on all fronts. Sinai Peninsula, Egypt. Israeli forces pushed deep into Sinai, defeating Egyptian divisions in swift armored battles. Within days, Israel reached the Suez Canal. West Bank, Jordan. Fierce fighting erupted around Jerusalem. Israeli troops captured East Jerusalem, including the Old City and the Western Wall. A deeply symbolic victory for the Jewish people. By June 7, Israel had control of the entire West Bank. Golan Heights, Syria. After initially holding back, Israel launched an offensive against Syria on June 9. Despite difficult terrain, Israeli troops captured the Golan Heights by June 10, removing the threat of Syrian artillery fire on northern Israel. The outcome: in just 6 days, Israel achieved a stunning victory. The war ended on June 10, 1967, with Israel in control of vast new territories: the Sinai Peninsula and Gaza Strip from Egypt, the West Bank, including East Jerusalem from Jordan, the Golan Heights from Syria. Israel had more than tripled the territory under its control. The psychological impact was enormous. Israelis celebrated a miraculous victory, while the Arab world was left in shock and humiliation. Consequences for Palestinians. For Palestinians, the war was another disaster. The West Bank and Gaza, home to large Palestinian populations, now came under Israeli military occupation. Around 300,000 Palestinians fled or were displaced during and after the fighting. Many became refugees for the second time since 1948. Palestinians who remained in the West Bank and Gaza now lived under direct Israeli rule, facing restrictions, checkpoints, and military administration. The conflict had entered a new phase, one of occupation that continues to this day. In September 1967, Arab leaders met in Khartoum, Sudan, and issued the famous 3 No's resolution: no peace with Israel, no recognition of Israel, no negotiations with Israel. This hardened stance ensured that the conflict would continue. At the same time, the defeat pushed Palestinians to take matters into their own hands. The Palestine Liberation Organization, PLO, founded in 1964, grew stronger. Under Yasser Arafat's leadership, it became the main political and military voice of the Palestinian people. The Six-Day War had repercussions far beyond the Middle East. It strengthened Israel's alliance with the United States, which saw Israel as a key Cold War partner. The Soviet Union doubled down on its support for Arab states, supplying them with weapons for revenge. The control of Jerusalem, with its holy sites, made the conflict even more charged with religious significance. The Six-Day War was a turning point. It redrew the map, created new realities, and intensified the struggle. Israel had gained territory that it considered vital for its security, but also inherited the responsibility of ruling over millions of Palestinians. Palestinians, displaced and occupied, intensified their struggle for statehood and resistance. The Arab states, humiliated, prepared for another war to regain their lands. The seeds of future conflicts, the Yom Kippur War of 1973, the rise of Palestinian militancy, and decades of occupation and negotiation, were all planted in June 1967. The Six-Day War of 1967 left Israel triumphant, but the Arab world humiliated. Egypt had lost the Sinai Peninsula, Syria had lost the Golan Heights, and Jordan had lost the West Bank and East Jerusalem. For Palestinians, the dream of an independent state seemed further away than ever. But Arab leaders were not prepared to accept defeat as permanent. In 1973, just 6 years after their crushing loss, Egypt and Syria launched a surprise offensive that shook Israel to its core. This conflict is remembered as the Yom Kippur War in Israel and the October War or Ramadan War in the Arab world. After 1967, Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser vowed to recover the Sinai. When Nasser died in 1970, his successor, Anwar Sadat, took up the cause. Sadat believed that regaining Sinai was essential for Egypt's pride and survival. At the same time, Syrian President Hafez al-Assad was determined to recover the Golan Heights. Both Egypt and Syria rearmed with massive help from the Soviet Union, which supplied advanced tanks, aircraft, and surface-to-air missiles. Despite Arab determination, Israel grew complacent. Flush with confidence after the Six-Day War, many Israelis believed their military dominance was unshakable. The intelligence services even dismissed warnings of an Arab attack, convinced that Egypt and Syria would not dare to strike. On October 6, 1973, during Yom Kippur, the holiest day in Judaism, Egypt and Syria launched a coordinated assault. The timing was symbolic. Israel was at its most vulnerable, with many soldiers on leave and the nation at rest. On the Sinai front, Egyptian forces crossed the Suez Canal under heavy artillery cover. Using portable bridges and water cannons to break through sand defenses, they overwhelmed Israeli positions. Within hours, Egypt had established strong bridgeheads on the eastern bank of the canal. On the Golan front, Syrian forces stormed Israeli defenses on the Golan Heights. With hundreds of tanks and thousands of troops, they pushed deep into Israeli territory, threatening northern Israel. For the first time since 1948, Israel faced the real danger of being overrun. The early days of the war were disastrous for Israel. Its air force, once dominant, was neutralized by Soviet-made surface-to-air missiles. Its armored divisions suffered heavy losses from Egyptian infantry armed with modern anti-tank weapons. But Israel quickly regrouped. Mobilizing reserves, it launched counterattacks on both fronts. In Sinai, under General Ariel Sharon, Israeli forces executed a daring maneuver. After days of bloody fighting, they crossed the Suez Canal into Egypt, cutting off Egyptian supply lines. On the Golan Heights, Israeli troops halted the Syrian advance and then pushed back, eventually reaching within artillery range of Damascus. The tide of the war had turned. The Yom Kippur War was not just a regional conflict, it was also a Cold War showdown. The Soviet Union resupplied Egypt and Syria with weapons and threatened intervention when Arab forces were in danger of collapse. The United States, initially caught off guard, airlifted weapons and supplies to Israel in Operation Nickel Grass, ensuring its survival. The two superpowers even went on nuclear alert at one point, highlighting how dangerous the conflict had become. By late October, Israel had encircled the Egyptian Third Army in Sinai and advanced deep into Syrian territory. But both the US and the Soviet Union pushed hard for a ceasefire to avoid further escalation. On October 25, 1973, a UN-brokered ceasefire ended the fighting. Israel survived, but its sense of invincibility was shattered. It had lost over 2,500 soldiers, a heavy toll for a small country. The early setbacks created a psychological shock that lingered for years. Egypt and Syria regained honor. Even though Israel retained much of the territory, the initial successes of the Egyptian crossing restored Arab pride. For Sadat, this partial victory laid the groundwork for future diplomacy. The Arab oil embargo. In solidarity with Egypt and Syria, Arab oil producers imposed an embargo on countries supporting Israel, especially the United States. This triggered the 1973 oil crisis, quadrupling oil prices and reshaping global politics. For Palestinians, the war had mixed consequences. The PLO, led by Yasser Arafat, was not directly involved in the fighting, but the Arab states' renewed strength gave it more visibility. In 1974, the Arab League recognized the PLO as the sole legitimate representative of the Palestinian people. The PLO also gained a voice on the world stage when Arafat addressed the United Nations in 1974, symbolizing the internationalization of the Palestinian cause. The 1973 war was a turning point. Unlike 1967, Israel no longer felt untouchable. Its leaders began to consider that military victories alone could not guarantee security. For Egypt, the war paved the way for negotiations, eventually leading to the Camp David Accords of 1978 and the return of Sinai in exchange for peace with Israel. For Palestinians, the war's aftermath brought both hope and frustration. Hope that their cause was now impossible to ignore. Frustration that they still lacked a state of their own. The Yom Kippur War marked the end of one era of the Arab-Israeli conflict and the beginning of another, one where diplomacy and Palestinian armed struggle would play larger roles. But before peace talks could take shape, violence and conflict would continue, especially in Lebanon. The Yom Kippur War of 1973 shifted the dynamics of the Middle East. Egypt moved closer to diplomacy, eventually making peace with Israel. But for Palestinians, the war highlighted their need to lead their own struggle. The Palestine Liberation Organization, PLO, under Yasser Arafat, emerged as the central voice of the Palestinian cause. By the late 1970s and early 1980s, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict had expanded beyond the borders of Israel and the occupied territories. The focus shifted north to Lebanon, where the PLO had established its base of operations. This new front would lead to a bloody and controversial war in 1982, dragging Israel into one of its most divisive military campaigns. After being expelled from Jordan during the Black September conflict of 1970, the PLO relocated to Lebanon. There, it established a state within a state, controlling refugee camps and launching cross-border attacks against Israel from southern Lebanon. Lebanon, already fragile due to sectarian divisions, was pushed into further turmoil. In 1975, a full-scale Lebanese civil war erupted, involving Christian militias, Muslim factions, Palestinian groups, and later foreign powers like Syria and Israel. For Israel, the PLO's presence in Lebanon was intolerable. Northern Israeli towns and villages were under constant threat from rocket attacks and raids. Throughout the late 1970s, clashes between Israel and the PLO escalated. In 1978, Israel invaded southern Lebanon in Operation Litani, aiming to push PLO fighters away from the border. The operation was short-lived, and international pressure forced Israel to withdraw, leaving behind a buffer zone controlled by the United Nations Interim Force in Lebanon, UNIFIL. But violence continued. In 1981, heavy fighting broke out again, with PLO rockets striking Israeli cities and Israeli airstrikes pounding Beirut and southern Lebanon. The final spark came in June 1982, when Palestinian militants attempted to assassinate Israel's ambassador in London. Although the attackers were not directly under PLO orders, Israel used the incident as justification for a full-scale invasion. On June 6, 1982, Israel launched Operation Peace for Galilee, invading Lebanon with the declared aim of pushing PLO forces 40 kilometers north of the border. But the operation quickly expanded far beyond that. Israeli forces advanced all the way to Beirut, laying siege to the capital. For weeks, Israeli tanks and artillery bombarded the city, while airstrikes devastated neighborhoods. Thousands of civilians were killed, and much of Beirut was reduced to rubble. Under international pressure, the United States brokered a deal. By September 1982, the PLO agreed to evacuate from Lebanon, with thousands of its fighters relocated to Tunisia and other Arab countries. But the war's most infamous event occurred after the PLO's evacuation. In September 1982, Israel's Christian militia allies, the Phalangists, entered the Palestinian refugee camps of Sabra and Shatila in West Beirut. Over the course of several days, they massacred hundreds, possibly thousands, of Palestinian civilians. Israeli forces, which controlled the area, were accused of allowing the massacre to happen by failing to intervene. The atrocity caused international outrage. Inside Israel, massive protests erupted, with hundreds of thousands of Israelis demanding accountability. A government inquiry later found Defense Minister Ariel Sharon indirectly responsible, forcing his resignation. Although the PLO left Lebanon, Israel did not fully withdraw. It maintained a military presence in southern Lebanon, creating a so-called security zone in alliance with the South Lebanon Army, SLA, a local Christian militia. But Israeli forces now faced a new enemy, Hezbollah, a Shi'a militant group backed by Iran and Syria, which emerged in the mid-1980s. Hezbollah carried out bombings, ambushes, and rocket attacks, turning southern Lebanon into a quagmire for Israeli troops. This low-intensity conflict dragged on for years. Israel finally withdrew from most of Lebanon in 2000, though Hezbollah continued to gain power and influence. The Lebanon War was not just about Israel and the PLO. It had broader regional consequences. Syria, which had troops in Lebanon, clashed indirectly with Israel during the war. Though it did not confront Israel head-on, it remained a major power broker in Lebanon. The United States. The U.S. deployed peacekeepers to Lebanon after the PLO evacuation. But in 1983, Hezbollah carried out a massive suicide bombing against the U.S. Marine barracks in Beirut, killing 241 American servicemen. This attack led to a U.S. withdrawal. Iran. The Iranian Revolution of 1979 had already transformed the region. By supporting Hezbollah, Iran established itself as a key player in the conflict, deepening the Israel-Iran rivalry. The 1982 Lebanon War was a devastating blow for Palestinians. The PLO lost its stronghold in Lebanon and was forced to move its headquarters to distant Tunisia, weakening its ability to directly fight Israel. Refugees in Lebanon, left vulnerable, suffered greatly during and after the conflict. Yet, the Palestinian struggle did not disappear. Instead, it shifted focus back to the occupied territories, the West Bank and Gaza, where decades of frustration under Israeli control were about to explode into a new phase of resistance. The 1982 war left scars on all sides. For Israel, it was one of its most controversial wars. Though it succeeded in driving the PLO out of Lebanon, the prolonged occupation of southern Lebanon and the Sabra and Shatila massacre damaged Israel's reputation internationally and divided its own society. For Lebanon, the war deepened the chaos of its civil war and opened the door for Hezbollah's rise. For Palestinians, it was a painful reminder of their vulnerability, but also a turning point, shifting the center of the struggle back to their homeland. By the late 1980s, Palestinian frustration in the occupied territories reached a breaking point. In 1987, the First Intifada erupted, marking a new chapter in the conflict. One led not by distant fighters in Lebanon, but by ordinary Palestinians living under occupation. By the mid-1980s, the Palestinian struggle had reached a turning point. The PLO, once the main vehicle of armed resistance, was weakened after its expulsion from Lebanon in 1982. Its leadership, now based in Tunisia, was far from the daily reality of Palestinians living under Israeli occupation in the West Bank and Gaza. For 2 decades, Palestinians in the occupied territories had lived under military rule. Land was confiscated, settlements expanded, and movement was restricted. Refugee camps were overcrowded and impoverished. Frustration and hopelessness grew with each passing year. In December 1987, that frustration exploded into a popular uprising known as the First Intifada, or shaking off. It was not initiated by the PLO leadership abroad, but by ordinary Palestinians on the ground. The immediate trigger came on December 8, 1987, when an Israeli truck collided with a car carrying Palestinian workers in Gaza, killing 4 of them. Many Palestinians saw the crash not as an accident but as a deliberate act, igniting widespread anger. The next day, protests broke out in Gaza, quickly spreading to the West Bank and East Jerusalem. What began as spontaneous demonstrations grew into a full-scale uprising. Unlike previous wars fought by armies, the Intifada was a popular movement. Palestinians organized mass demonstrations, strikes, and boycotts of Israeli goods. Youths threw stones and Molotov cocktails at Israeli soldiers and vehicles. Communities created underground networks to coordinate protests and distribute leaflets. Graffiti became a powerful form of resistance, covering walls with slogans and calls for unity. For Israel, this presented a new kind of challenge. The Intifada was not a conventional war with clear battlefronts. Instead, it was a grassroots revolt that could not easily be crushed by military power. Israel responded with force. Soldiers were deployed in large numbers, and clashes with protesters became daily events. Arrests, curfews, and house demolitions became common. Thousands of Palestinians were imprisoned, and hundreds were killed during confrontations. The international media played a crucial role. Images of heavily armed Israeli soldiers confronting stone-throwing youths spread worldwide, shaping global perceptions of the conflict. For many outside observers, the asymmetry of power became starkly visible, fueling sympathy for the Palestinian cause. Although the Intifada began locally, the Palestine Liberation Organization soon embraced it. From its base in Tunisia, the PLO attempted to guide the uprising through the unified national leadership of the uprising, a coalition of Palestinian groups. At the same time, the Intifada gave rise to a new player, Hamas, founded in Gaza in 1987. Emerging from the Muslim Brotherhood, Hamas combined religious ideology with armed struggle. Unlike the secular PLO, Hamas rejected negotiations with Israel and called for its destruction. Its rise would profoundly shape the conflict in the years ahead. The Intifada also reshaped Israel's internal politics. The uprising convinced many Israelis that ruling over millions of Palestinians indefinitely was unsustainable. Some began to argue that peace and compromise were necessary for long-term security. But the violence also hardened others, strengthening right-wing voices that demanded harsher crackdowns. Israeli society became increasingly divided over how to deal with the Palestinian question. The First Intifada dramatically changed the international landscape. The Palestinian issue returned to global attention. After years of being overshadowed by conflicts in Lebanon and wars with Arab states, the world now focused directly on the plight of Palestinians under occupation. In 1988, Yasser Arafat made a historic declaration, accepting the idea of a Palestinian state alongside Israel, based on the pre-1967 borders. This marked a significant shift in the PLO's position, signaling willingness to negotiate. Many countries and international organizations began engaging with the PLO as the legitimate representative of the Palestinian people. By the early 1990s, the uprising had taken a heavy toll. The economic cost for both Palestinians and Israelis was high, and the violence had claimed thousands of lives. Meanwhile, global politics were shifting. The Cold War ended, reducing Soviet influence in the Middle East. The United States, emerging as the dominant superpower, took a more active role in pursuing peace. In 1991, following the Gulf War, the U.S. convened the Madrid Conference, bringing Israelis and Palestinians to the same negotiating table for the first time. Although the talks did not produce immediate results, they laid the groundwork for direct negotiations. By 1993, after 6 years of protests, violence, and repression, the First Intifada gradually came to an end. Its legacy was profound. It had reshaped Palestinian politics, giving rise to new factions and voices. It had pressured Israel into considering negotiations seriously. It had paved the way for the Oslo Accords, a landmark peace process that would begin in the early 1990s. For Palestinians, the Intifada was both a moment of empowerment and tragedy. Empowerment because it demonstrated that ordinary people could resist occupation and command the world's attention. Tragedy because it resulted in widespread suffering, repression, and internal divisions that would haunt the movement in the years to come. The First Intifada marked a turning point in the conflict. Unlike previous wars between states, it was a struggle waged in the streets, refugee camps, and daily life of Palestinians. It highlighted the human cost of occupation and forced both sides to confront the reality that neither could simply erase the other. The world now awaited the next chapter, a bold attempt at peace that would raise hopes higher than ever before. That chapter was the Oslo Accords and the turbulent years of the Second Intifada. The First Intifada, 1987 to 1993, changed everything. It showed the world that Palestinians under occupation could not be ignored, and it pushed both sides toward diplomacy. By the early 1990s, secret negotiations began, leading to the most ambitious peace process yet, the Oslo Accords. But while Oslo brought unprecedented hope, it also planted seeds of disappointment. Within a decade, the dream of peace collapsed into one of the bloodiest chapters of the conflict, the Second Intifada. In 1993, after months of secret talks in Norway, Israeli and Palestinian representatives reached an agreement. The Oslo Accords were historic. For the first time, both sides officially recognized each other. The PLO, led by Yasser Arafat, recognized Israel's right to exist. Israel recognized the PLO as the representative of the Palestinian people. The accords created the Palestinian Authority, PA, granting limited self-rule in parts of the West Bank and Gaza. The idea was that over 5 years, negotiations would resolve the biggest issues: borders, settlements, refugees, and Jerusalem. The signing ceremony on the White House lawn with U.S. President Bill Clinton standing between Arafat and Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin as they shook hands became one of the most iconic images of the 1990s. For many, it was a moment of hope. Could decades of conflict finally end? From the start, Oslo faced fierce opposition. Many Palestinians felt the deal gave away too much, leaving settlements in place and failing to guarantee a state. Many Israelis, especially on the right, saw Oslo as a dangerous gamble that put Israel's security at risk. Violence continued. Radical Palestinian groups like Hamas and Islamic Jihad carried out suicide bombings inside Israel, aiming to derail the peace process. On the Israeli side, extremist settlers resisted by expanding outposts and attacking Palestinians. The biggest blow came in 1995, when Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin, who had signed Oslo, was assassinated by an Israeli extremist opposed to the peace process. His death was a devastating setback. In the late 1990s, negotiations dragged on but failed to resolve key issues. Settlements in the West Bank expanded instead of shrinking. The Palestinian Authority struggled with corruption and inefficiency, weakening public trust. The final chance came in 2000, when U.S. President Bill Clinton hosted Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak and Arafat at Camp David. Talks broke down over Jerusalem, refugees, and borders. Both sides blamed each other for the failure. Disappointment turned to anger. Within months, violence erupted again. The Second Intifada, also known as the Al-Aqsa Intifada, began in September 2000. The immediate trigger was a provocative visit by Israeli opposition leader Ariel Sharon to the Al-Aqsa Mosque compound in Jerusalem, a site sacred to both Muslims and Jews. Palestinians saw it as an assault on their dignity and rights. Protests broke out, met with harsh Israeli force. Very quickly, the unrest escalated into a full-scale uprising, more violent than the first. The Second Intifada was marked by unprecedented violence. Palestinian tactics shifted from stone-throwing to suicide bombings, shootings, and rocket attacks, targeting buses, markets, and restaurants in Israeli cities. Israel's response was overwhelming. The army reoccupied Palestinian cities, imposed strict curfews, and carried out targeted assassinations of militant leaders. Tanks rolled into refugee camps, and helicopter gunships struck suspected militants. From 2000 to 2005, more than 3,000 Palestinians and around 1,000 Israelis were killed. Civilians bore the brunt on both sides. In 2002, after a wave of suicide bombings, Israel launched Operation Defensive Shield, the largest military operation in the West Bank since 1967. Cities like Jenin, Ramallah, and Nablus were placed under siege. The destruction was massive, with homes and infrastructure demolished. The operation weakened militant networks but also deepened Palestinian resentment. During the Second Intifada, Israel began constructing a massive separation barrier in and around the West Bank. Israel argued it was necessary to stop suicide bombers, and indeed, attacks decreased sharply once sections were built. But Palestinians saw the barrier, which cut into West Bank land rather than following the 1967 border, as a land grab, fragmenting their communities and making statehood even harder to achieve. The violence reshaped leadership on both sides. Ariel Sharon, once reviled for his role in the 1982 Lebanon War, rose to power as Israeli Prime Minister, promising security through strength. Yasser Arafat's authority weakened as Israel besieged him in his Ramallah compound. By the time of his death in 2004, he was seen by many Israelis as an obstacle to peace, and by many Palestinians as a leader who failed to deliver independence. In 2005, Mahmoud Abbas succeeded Arafat as president of the Palestinian Authority, advocating nonviolence and negotiations. By 2005, exhaustion set in. Both sides had suffered enormous losses, and neither achieved victory. The Second Intifada ended without resolution, leaving behind scars of mistrust, trauma, and destruction. But that same year, Israel made a dramatic move. It withdrew unilaterally from the Gaza Strip, dismantling settlements and pulling out troops. While some saw this as a step toward peace, others viewed it as a strategic retreat that set the stage for future conflicts with Hamas. The Oslo Accords had once promised a new dawn. Instead, they ended in disillusionment. The Second Intifada hardened attitudes on both sides. Many Israelis concluded that Palestinians were not ready for peace. Many Palestinians concluded that negotiations brought only more settlements and occupation. The dream of a two-state solution, so alive in the 1990s, seemed further away than ever. But history was not finished. In Gaza, a new chapter was beginning, one dominated by Hamas, blockades, and repeated wars that would define the conflict in the 21st century. The Second Intifada, 2000 to 2005, left both Israelis and Palestinians battered and disillusioned. In 2005, Israel withdrew its settlers and troops from the Gaza Strip, ending nearly 4 decades of direct occupation there. For a brief moment, it seemed like Gaza might become the foundation of a future Palestinian state. But instead, Gaza became the epicenter of new and devastating wars. The rise of Hamas in Gaza in 2006, the Palestinian Authority held elections. To the surprise of many, Hamas, the Islamist movement that had gained popularity during the First Intifada, won a majority. Hamas's victory reflected Palestinian frustration with the corruption and inefficiency of the Palestinian Authority under Mahmoud Abbas and Fatah. The result triggered a political crisis. Fatah and Hamas clashed violently, and in 2007, Hamas seized full control of Gaza, driving out Fatah forces. From then on, the Palestinian territories were divided. Hamas ruled Gaza, while the Palestinian Authority controlled the West Bank. Israel, along with Egypt, imposed a blockade on Gaza, restricting movement of people and goods. Israel argued the blockade was necessary to prevent weapons smuggling, while Palestinians saw it as collective punishment that devastated daily life. The First Gaza War, 2008 to 2009, Operation Cast Lead tensions boiled over in late 2008. After years of rocket fire from Gaza and Israeli strikes in response, Israel launched a large-scale assault known as Operation Cast Lead. Israeli airstrikes targeted Hamas infrastructure, followed by a ground invasion. Hamas fighters resisted with rockets and ambushes but were outgunned. Civilians bore the brunt. More than 1,000 Palestinians were killed, many of them non-combatants. Israel lost 13 people, including 3 civilians. The war ended in early 2009 with a fragile ceasefire, but Gaza lay in ruins. The Second Gaza War, 2012. Operation Pillar of Defense in 2012, violence flared again. Israel assassinated a top Hamas military commander, sparking days of intense fighting. Hamas launched hundreds of rockets, some reaching as far as Tel Aviv and Jerusalem for the first time. Israel responded with airstrikes but avoided a ground invasion. After 8 days, Egypt brokered a ceasefire. The death toll was lower than in 2008, but the cycle of violence had clearly resumed. The Third Gaza War, 2014. Operation Protective Edge, the most destructive war in Gaza, came in 2014. The immediate trigger was the kidnapping and killing of 3 Israeli teenagers in the West Bank, followed by the killing of a Palestinian youth in Jerusalem. Violence escalated rapidly into full-scale war. For 50 days, Gaza endured relentless bombardment. Israeli airstrikes and a ground offensive targeted Hamas tunnels and rocket sites. Hamas and other militant groups fired thousands of rockets into Israel. Entire neighborhoods in Gaza were destroyed. The human toll was staggering. Over 2,000 Palestinians were killed, including hundreds of children, while Israel lost 73 people, mostly soldiers. The destruction left Gaza's already fragile infrastructure in ruins. Even after the 2014 war, Gaza remained a tinderbox. Every few years, clashes erupted. 2018 to 2019. Mass protests along the Gaza-Israel border, known as the Great March of Return, were met with deadly Israeli gunfire. Dozens of Palestinians were killed. 2021. A new war broke out after tensions in Jerusalem and Israeli raids at Al-Aqsa Mosque. Hamas launched rockets at Israel, and Israel responded with heavy airstrikes. Over 250 Palestinians and 13 Israelis were killed. Smaller escalations have occurred frequently, with rocket fire, Israeli strikes, and fragile ceasefires becoming a grim routine. The repeated wars have left Gaza devastated. Its infrastructure, homes, hospitals, schools, and power plants, has been repeatedly destroyed. The blockade has created chronic shortages of food, medicine, and fuel. Unemployment rates are among the highest in the world. For many Palestinians in Gaza, life has become a cycle of rebuilding after destruction, only to face new devastation within years. On the Israeli side, civilians live under the constant threat of rocket fire. Sirens, bomb shelters, and disrupted lives are a part of daily reality in southern Israel. The Gaza Wars have drawn global attention and controversy. Israel argues it has the right to defend itself from rocket attacks. Critics argue that Israel's military campaigns use disproportionate force, inflicting heavy civilian casualties. Hamas, for its part, is condemned internationally for targeting civilians with rockets and using populated areas for military purposes. The wars have deepened polarization worldwide, with Gaza becoming a powerful symbol of Palestinian suffering and a reminder of the conflict's intractability. The repeated conflicts in Gaza show how deeply divided the Israeli-Palestinian conflict has become. Oslo's promise of peace in the 1990s gave way to endless war and cycles of retaliation. For Palestinians, especially in Gaza, the wars have reinforced despair and a sense of abandonment. For Israelis, the threat of Hamas rockets underscores the fear that any withdrawal from territory will only invite more attacks. Gaza has become a focal point of the conflict, not only militarily but symbolically. It represents the failure of diplomacy, the suffering of civilians, and the tragic cycle of violence that neither side has managed to escape. As the world watches, the question remains: will Gaza continue to be the battleground of endless wars, or can it someday become the foundation of peace? By the mid-2010s, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict seemed locked in a tragic cycle. Negotiations collapsed, Gaza wars erupted, and life under occupation and blockade grew harsher. The dream of a two-state solution, once the centerpiece of diplomacy, appeared more distant than ever. Since 2021, a new wave of violence, politics, and regional shifts has reshaped the conflict once again. The 2021 escalation in May 2021, tensions in East Jerusalem erupted over the planned evictions of Palestinian families in the Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood, combined with Israeli police raids at the Al-Aqsa Mosque during Ramadan. These events ignited protests across Jerusalem and the West Bank. In response, Hamas launched rockets toward Jerusalem and Tel Aviv, while Israel carried out heavy airstrikes on Gaza. The fighting lasted 11 days. Over 250 Palestinians were killed, mostly in Gaza, along with 13 Israelis. International outrage grew, but a ceasefire mediated by Egypt eventually halted the fighting. The 2021 war highlighted how quickly local disputes, like evictions or police raids, can escalate into regional conflict. Shifting regional landscape at the same time, the regional environment was changing. In 2020, several Arab states, including the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Morocco, and Sudan, normalized relations with Israel under the Abraham Accords, brokered by the United States. These agreements broke with decades of Arab consensus that peace with Israel should come only after a resolution of the Palestinian issue. For Palestinians, this felt like a betrayal, deepening their sense of isolation. Israel gained new allies, but the core conflict with the Palestinians remained unresolved. The humanitarian crisis in Gaza. By the 2020s, Gaza's humanitarian situation had reached catastrophic levels. The blockade, wars, and political division between Hamas and the Palestinian Authority created an economy in collapse. Unemployment soared above 40. Electricity was available only for a few hours a day. Clean water and medical supplies were in constant shortage. For many of Gaza's 2 million residents, especially its youth, Life felt like a prison with no future. 2022 to 2023 escalations in the following years. Violence persisted. Periodic clashes in Gaza resulted in exchanges of rocket fire and airstrikes. In the West Bank, tensions rose sharply. Israeli raids in Jenin, Nablus, and other cities killed dozens of Palestinians. Armed resistance groups began re-emerging in refugee camps. Settler violence against Palestinians in the West Bank increased, adding to the tension. The fragile status quo seemed increasingly unstable. Global events also shaped the conflict. The United States remained Israel's closest ally, but domestic debates about U.S. aid to Israel became sharper. The United Nations and humanitarian organizations repeatedly warned of a worsening crisis, particularly in Gaza. Shifts in global politics, such as the war in Ukraine and U.S.-China competition, meant that international attention often drifted away from the conflict, leaving Palestinians feeling more isolated. Despite decades of failed negotiations, the central issues remain the same: borders. Where would an Israeli and Palestinian state be drawn? Jerusalem. Can it ever be shared? Or will both sides cling to exclusive claims? Refugees. What happens to millions of Palestinians displaced since 1948? Security. How can Israel guarantee safety while Palestinians secure freedom? With each passing year, the possibility of a two-state solution grows harder. Israeli settlements in the West Bank expand, fragmenting Palestinian territory. Meanwhile, some Palestinians now call for a one-state solution, though this raises its own challenges over identity, rights, and governance. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict remains one of the world's most intractable disputes. For Israelis, the memory of wars, rocket fire, and terrorism reinforces the demand for security. For Palestinians, decades of displacement, occupation, and blockade fuel the demand for dignity and independence. Both peoples remain trapped in a struggle shaped by history, trauma, and mistrust. Yet, history also shows that change is possible. The Camp David Accords in 1978, Oslo in 1993, and even short-lived ceasefires all prove that diplomacy, however fragile, can make progress. The future depends on whether leaders and ordinary people on both sides can find the courage to imagine something different from endless war. From the wars of 1948 to the uprisings of the Intifadas, from the failed promise of Oslo to the devastation of Gaza, the story of Israel and Palestine is a story of pain, resilience, and the longing for peace. It is a story unfinished. The next chapter has yet to be written. Stay connected by hitting subscribe button to get more historical knowledge.